After decades of silence, two hearts marked by time meet again where it all began. Between old wounds and a present threat, an unexpected reunion could change the fate of a farm and maybe rekindle something that never really died. Welcome to the channel. Before we begin, please like and subscribe so we can continue creating stories like this one. Under the gray sky of Pine Creek, a small fictional town nestled in the American heartland, Jack Mercer slowly traveled the dirt road that cut through his properties. His chestnut horse named Thunder advanced in measured steps, as if also carrying the weight of his owner's concerns. The Hope Ranch, which had once been a symbol of prosperity in the region, was now merely a shadow of what it once represented. At 58, Jack carried on his sun-marked face the invisible scars of a lifetime dedicated to that land. The deep wrinkles around his eyes weren't just the result of age, but also of sleepless nights thinking about how to save the heritage of 5 generations of the Mercer family. "This year's drought was the worst in decades, Thunder," he murmured to the animal, as if it could understand the weight of his words. "And now this bank wanting to take our lands." The ranch, which had once employed more than 50 workers and supplied markets throughout the region, was now reduced to a few productive acres and an astronomical debt with the Rural Bank of America. Rumors in town already took for granted the execution of the mortgage and the auction of the land to a group of businessmen from Chicago who planned to transform everything into soybean fields. In town, meanwhile, Margaret Allen meticulously arranged the shelves of her small handicraft store. At 55, she faced the world with a determination that intimidated even the toughest men in the region. Blind since 17 due to a degenerative disease, she had developed a fierce independence and an even sharper tongue. "Sophie, please put the Riverdale embroideries in the front display and organize the ceramics by size, not by color, as I've explained 1,000 times," she instructed her young assistant, a 16-year-old girl who secretly admired the strength of that woman. "Yes, Miss Margaret," replied the girl, observing how her boss detected the slightest misalignment just by touch. The small town of Pine Creek was buzzing with rumors about the possible loss of Hope Ranch. For many residents, it would represent the end of an era. The Mercer property was part of the local identity, a living historical heritage that had withstood wars, economic crises, and bad weather. "I heard Jack is finally going to lose everything," commented a customer entering the store. "A shame. Traditional family." Margaret, who appeared to be focused on her tasks, felt a tightness in her chest that she didn't show. Behind the dark glasses she always wore, her sightless eyes revealed no emotion, but her hands trembled slightly. "Since when has someone else's misfortune become a topic for commerce, Mr. Thompson?" she responded harshly. "If you didn't come to buy anything, don't take up space from those who do." The man, embarrassed, muttered an apology and quickly left the store. Sophie observed the scene with curiosity. It wasn't the first time she had noticed a defensive reaction from Margaret when the subject was Jack Mercer or Hope Ranch. Meanwhile, on the narrow bridge connecting the town to the Mercer lands, Jack continued his solitary path. The wooden structure built by his great-grandfather in the late 19th century creaked under the weight of the rider and his mount. That's when he spotted a familiar silhouette standing in the middle of the path. The rancher's heart quickened. After so many years, he would still recognize that proud posture anywhere in the world. Margaret was standing exactly in the center of the bridge, as if waiting for him, although they both knew that this encounter could only be the work of chance, or perhaps destiny. Thunder instinctively slowed his pace, as if sensing the growing tension in the air. The bridge's wood continued to emit small cracks, enough for Margaret to know she was no longer alone. "Who's there?" she asked firmly, turning her head in the direction of the sound, despite not being able to see. "It's me, Margaret. Jack's." Voice came out lower than he intended, laden with long-repressed emotions. The silence that followed seemed to last an eternity. On the horizon, darker clouds announced rain, something rare for that time of year. "Perhaps an omen." "Jack Mercer," she finally replied, the name coming out like an accusation. "I thought you'd be too busy negotiating the sale of your precious ranch to be out and about." The rancher sighed. Even after 38 years, she could still hit him like no one else. "I'm not selling anything, Margaret. They're taking it from me." It was then that the wind changed direction, bringing with it the unmistakable smell of approaching rain. A lightning bolt cut across the sky in the distance, illuminating for an instant the hardened face of that woman who had once been the center of his world. "And that's supposed to move me?" she asked with disdain. "You reap what you sow, Jack. We always reap what we sow." The words cut through the air like sharp knives, revealing that time had not healed certain wounds. The past, shared by the two, was a secret that the small town of Pine Creek only intuited, but never really knew. "You never let me explain," he tried, his trembling voice betraying his usual stoic posture. "Explain what? How you abandoned me when I needed you most? How you chose your land and your money while I lost my sight alone in a hospital in New York?" Thunder stirred, sensing his owner's growing tension. The narrow bridge suddenly seemed even smaller, insufficient to contain the magnitude of that confrontation that had taken decades to happen. "It wasn't like that, Margaret. I went there, but your family, son..." "My family?" she interrupted, taking a step toward the sound of his voice. "Don't blame my family for your choices." At that moment, another lightning bolt illuminated the sky, this time followed by a deafening thunder. The horse whinnied, frightened, and Jack tried to calm him, but the animal took a few abrupt steps on the narrow bridge. Margaret, confused by the sounds and vibrations, advanced a few more steps, driven by decades of accumulated anger. Her cane hit something, probably the horse's hoof, and Thunder got even more scared. What happened next was so fast that not even Jack could fully comprehend it. In his attempt to keep Margaret away from the frightened animal, he lost his balance. A sudden movement, an unintentional push, and the rancher felt the world spin around him. The fall wasn't high, but the stream under the bridge was fuller than usual due to recent rains. Jack fell on his back in the water, hitting his head on a submerged rock. He didn't completely lose consciousness, but was dazed, unable to move for a few crucial seconds. It was then that Thunder did something extraordinary. The animal, which had always been known for its docility, demonstrated an almost supernatural intelligence. Instead of running away frightened, it carefully descended the stream bank, approaching its fallen owner. With its muzzle, it began to push Jack as if trying to help him get up. On the bridge, Margaret shouted, disoriented. "Jack, what happened? Did you fall? Answer me." The rancher, still dizzy, finally managed to sit up in the shallow water. He looked up and saw Margaret leaning over the bridge railing, her face contorted in an expression of genuine concern. "I'm fine," he replied with difficulty. "Don't worry. Don't get near the edge." Thunder remained by his owner's side, vigilant and protective, a behavior that would surprise anyone familiar with horses. The animal seemed to perfectly understand the dangerous situation and its role in it. It was in that instant, with Jack soaked trying to stand up and Margaret distressed on the bridge, that something changed between them. As if time had gone back, as if the hurts accumulated over decades could, perhaps, begin to be washed away just as the stream water was now washing the rancher's clothes. The sky finally fulfilled its promise, and the rain began to fall, first in sparse drops, then in a steady downpour. On that bridge that connected not only two portions of land, but also two destinies that should never have been separated, a dormant story began to awaken. And Thunder, the silent equine witness, seemed to be the only one to fully understand the importance of that moment. The news of the accident on the bridge spread through Pine Creek with the typical speed of small country towns. Within hours, distorted versions of what had happened were already circulating through bars, grocery stores, and beauty salons. The most popular version transformed Margaret into a heroine who had saved Jack from drowning, something that made the woman roll her sightless eyes whenever she heard it. "For God's sake, I pushed him into the water. How can they say I saved him?" she grumbled to Sophie as they organized the inventory at the craft store 3 days after the incident. "You didn't do it on purpose, Miss Margaret," argued the young assistant, "and Dr. Matthew said Mr. Jack is fine. Just a few scratches." Margaret snorted but didn't respond. What no one in town knew, and what not even Sophie imagined, was that the craft store had remained closed throughout the day following the accident. Its owner had asked the local taxi driver to take her to Hope Ranch, where she spent hours talking with Jack on the veranda of the main house. In that conversation, neither of them directly mentioned the past. They talked about the drought, about the ranch's financial difficulties, about Thunder's extraordinary behavior during the accident. But behind the trivial words, there was a universe of unspoken meanings, of glances that only one of them could see, of sighs that carried decades, of regrets. The morning after the accident, while examining Jack's minor injuries, the town's doctor, Dr. Matthew Coleman, couldn't help but notice the horse's unusual behavior. "This animal doesn't leave your side for a minute, Jack," he commented, observing how Thunder remained posted near the bedroom window, as if standing guard. "I've seen many, bonds between man and animal, but this is something different." Jack smiled, running his hand through his still damp graying hair from a recent bath. "Thunder has always been special. He's been with me for 15 years, since he was just a colt. But really, since the accident, he hasn't left me alone for even a second." The doctor finished applying a bandage to the cut the rancher had on his forehead and packed away his supplies. "You know what's most curious? They told me that right after the accident, Margaret Allen showed up here to check on you. The same. Margaret, who they say hadn't spoken a word to you in the last 30 years. Jack's face hardened slightly. "People talk too much in this town." "Yes, they do," agreed the doctor, closing his bag. "But they rarely understand what really matters." When the doctor left, Jack remained sitting on the edge of the bed for long minutes, lost in thought. The physical pain was insignificant compared to the emotional turmoil that the accident had awakened. Memories he had tried to bury now resurfaced with cruel clarity. Margaret Allen, the 17-year-old girl with whom he had fallen hopelessly in love. The daughter of the most prosperous merchant in the region, destined to study medicine in the capital, while he, at 20, already carried on his shoulders the responsibility of managing the ranch after his father's illness. They loved each other in secret for almost a year. Furtive meetings on the riverbanks, promises whispered under the starry Midwestern sky, plans for a future that seemed bright despite the objections they would certainly face. Then came the news of the disease, a rare degenerative condition that began to gradually steal Margaret's sight. Her parents took her to New York, where the country's best specialists couldn't reverse the inevitable. Jack sold part of the ranch's cattle to get money and traveled there determined to stay by her side, regardless of what happened. But upon arriving at the hospital, he was barred by her family. Margaret's father, Alexander Allen, blamed the relationship with Jack for the worsening of his daughter's condition. "She got worse after each of your letters," the man accused. "The doctors say emotional stress accelerated the degeneration. Never come near her again." Jack tried to send messages, letters, gifts. All were returned. When he finally managed to speak to Margaret by phone, weeks later she was unrecognizable, cold, distant, cutting in her words. "I don't need your pity, Jack," she said. "Go back to your ranch, to your perfect world where everything works as it should. I have to learn to live in the dark now." He never knew that Alexander had lied to his daughter, telling her that Jack only appeared at the hospital out of obligation, that he was engaged to another girl in Pine Creek, that the visit was just to clear his conscience. And so, too proud to insist in the face of apparent rejection, Jack returned to Pine Creek. He immersed himself in work, expanded the ranch, transformed pain into productivity. When Margaret returned to town 2 years later, already completely blind and with a fierce independence that intimidated everyone, they were already strangers who shared only bitter memories. 38 years passed like this. Occasional encounters at town festivals, distant nods, formal conversations about the weather or local politics. Nothing that suggested the fire that once consumed them. Until the day of the accident on the bridge. In the present, at the craft's door, Margaret felt a growing discomfort with the whispers surrounding her. The entire town was talking about Thunder's extraordinary behavior, about how the animal seemed to have saved its owner. A reporter from the regional newspaper even showed up to do a story about the case. "Sophie, you can close the store early." Today, Margaret suddenly decided, I have some matters to attend to." The young assistant observed her with curiosity. In recent weeks, her boss had been different, less bitter, more thoughtful, sometimes even distracted. Something unprecedented for someone who had always compensated for the lack of vision with redoubled attention to everything around her. "Are you going to visit Mr. Jack again?" Sophie asked, unable to contain her curiosity. Margaret turned abruptly toward the sound of the girl's voice. "And who said I visited him before?" Sophie swallowed hard. "I'm sorry, Miss Margaret. It's just that Tim from the taxi mentioned he took you to Hope Ranch the day after the accident, and this town has nothing better to do than gossip about other people's lives," Margaret completed harshly. Then, sighing, her voice softened a bit. "Yes, I'm going there. Jack has some old documents that might help me with the deed to the store, nothing more than that." Sophie nodded, even knowing that her boss couldn't see the gesture. "I understand. Would you like me to call Tim?" "Please," replied Margaret, grabbing her purse and cane. An hour later, Margaret was sitting on the veranda of Hope Ranch, feeling the afternoon sun on her face. Jack had served coffee, strong and without sugar, exactly as she had always liked. Some habits never changed, even after 4 decades. "The bank called early this morning," Jack commented, sitting in the chair beside her. "They offered a deal, but I'd still lose half the land." Margaret nodded slowly. "It's better than losing everything." A soft whinny interrupted them. Thunder approached, his hooves rhythmically hitting the wooden floor of the veranda. The animal stopped near Margaret's chair and, to her surprise, lowered its head until it gently touched her shoulder with its muzzle. "He likes you," Jack observed with a smile in his voice. "That's rare. Thunder is usually wary of strangers. I'm not exactly a stranger, am I?" The question hung in the air, laden with meanings. "No," he finally answered. "You never were." Margaret hesitantly extended her hand and touched the animal's mane. The rough texture under her fingers awakened an unexpected wave of emotions. Silent tears began to roll from behind her dark glasses. "My father lied to me, didn't he?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "About you. About why you appeared only once at the hospital." Jack felt his heart quicken. 38 years waiting for this conversation, for this specific question. "Yes," he answered simply. The silence that followed was filled only by the sound of the wind in the leaves of the apple trees in the yard and by Thunder's calm breathing, who remained motionless beside Margaret's chair. "Why did you never tell me?" she finally asked. "I tried in the beginning," Jack explained. "You didn't want to listen. Later pride spoke louder, and then the years passed and it seemed like it didn't matter anymore." Margaret removed her dark glasses, revealing the opaque eyes that had long not seen the light. It was a gesture of trust that she rarely demonstrated. Without the barrier of the glasses, her face seemed more vulnerable, more accessible. "I discovered the truth 15 years ago," she confessed. "My father, before leaving us, confessed everything. How he prevented you from seeing me, how he lied saying you were engaged to someone else." Jack was completely still. 15 years, he repeated, his voice choked with emotion, "and you never said anything." "Pride," she answered simply. "That same damn pride that separated us, and also fear. Fear that it was too late." Thunder moved restlessly, as if sensing the growing tension. Jack got up and stroked the animal's neck, calming it. Then, without thinking too much, he extended his hand and touched Margaret's face, drying a tear with his thumb. "It's never too late for the truth," he said. It was at that moment that the bank manager arrived, interrupting the conversation. The man, a young man in an impeccable suit with a Chicago accent, seemed out of place in that rural environment. He carried a folder full of documents and a commercial smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Mercer, I came personally to discuss the terms of the agreement," he announced, apparently oblivious to the intimate atmosphere he had just broken. Jack reluctantly moved away from Margaret. "Of course, Mr. Richard, we can talk in the office." As he followed the banker into the house, Jack cast one last look at Margaret, who had replaced her glasses and recovered her usual proud posture. The moment of vulnerability had passed, but something fundamental had changed between them. What neither of them noticed was that Thunder remained by Margaret's side, as if standing, guard, refusing to follow his owner into the house. A behavior that, later that same day, would generate even more speculation in the small town of Pine Creek. The days that followed brought an unusual routine for the residents of Pine Creek. Margaret Allen, known for her reclusiveness and difficult temperament, was now seen almost daily at Hope Ranch. At first, the official justification was that she was helping Jack with old documentation, but few in town believed this version. Documents? She's blind. How could she help with paperwork? Questioned Mrs. Edith, the owner of the Central Bakery, to anyone who would listen. And since when would Margaret help anyone without charging for it? Added Mr. Jerry, the retired barber who spent his days playing checkers in the town square. Speculations multiplied, but the truth behind those visits was more complex than anyone could imagine. After decades of distance, Jack and Margaret were slowly and very cautiously rebuilding a bridge between their separate worlds. It wasn't a romance, at least not in the conventional sense. It was something deeper and at the same time more fragile, a reconciliation with the past, an attempt to heal old wounds that had never completely healed. "I think we should tell the truth to the town," suggested Jack on a particularly pleasant afternoon as they drank coffee on the porch. Thunder, as always, was nearby, grazing peacefully a few meters away from them. "What truth?" asked Margaret, raising an eyebrow above her dark glasses. "That we were foolish young people who fell in love, were separated by lies, and now, 4 decades later, are sitting here drinking coffee like 2 old friends. Is that what you want to announce in the local newspaper?" Jack laughed, a sound that until recently had become rare. "Not exactly, but I'm tired of hearing absurd theories. Just yesterday, Father Joseph asked me, with all seriousness, if we were planning to get married." It was Margaret's turn to smile, though she tried to hide it. "And what did you answer?" "That you're too stubborn to accept any proposal of mine." A comfortable silence settled between them, filled only by the sound of the wind in the leaves and the occasional whinny from Thunder. That's how it was now. Light conversations interspersed with moments of deep reflection, without the need to fill every second with words. "What will happen to the ranch?" she finally asked, bringing up the subject that both had avoided in recent days. Jack sighed deeply before answering. "I'll lose the southern part where the new pasture is. The bank will take approximately 40% of the land, but at least I managed to keep the main house and the most productive areas." "And is that enough to continue?" "It will have to be," he answered with determination. "This land has been in my family for 5 generations, Margaret. I can't be the last Mercer to care for it." She nodded, understanding perfectly. Her own business, the craft store, had been built with the same iron determination after losing her sight. It was her way of proving to the world and to herself that blindness would not define her. "You know what's most curious about this whole story?" asked Jack, serving more coffee to both of them. "If it weren't for the accident on the bridge, we might never have had this conversation. It took Thunder doing something extraordinary for us to break decades of silence." As if understanding he was being mentioned, the horse raised his head and approached the porch, stopping near Margaret. Lately, the animal had shown an inexplicable preference for her company, something that intrigued everyone, including Jack. "He senses that you're special," commented the rancher. "Horses are sensitive to emotions in a way we don't fully understand." Margaret extended her hand, and Thunder immediately brought his muzzle closer, allowing her to pet him. "Or maybe he just likes the scent of my soap," she joked, although there was something in her voice that suggested a deeper emotion. The next day, something happened that would definitely change the dynamics between them and the town's perception. During one of Margaret's visits to the ranch, a strong storm suddenly formed, common for that time of year in the Midwest. The rains came accompanied by strong winds and thunders that frightened even the calmest animals in the corral. Jack, concerned about a newborn calf, quickly went out to check the stable, leaving Margaret on the porch. "I'll be back in a few minutes," he assured her, running under the rain. While waiting, Margaret heard a deafening noise. Lightning had struck a tree near the house. The noise was so intense that she startled, dropping the coffee cup she was holding. Disoriented by the fright and Jack's absence, she tried to get up too quickly, tripping and falling from the porch. The fall wasn't serious, but Margaret hit her knee hard and for a moment lay in the mud, feeling the intense rain completely soak her. Her cane had escaped far away, and without it in an outdoor environment and under adverse conditions, her mobility was severely compromised. "Jack!" she shouted, but her voice was muffled by the sound of the storm. "Jack, I need help!" It was then that she felt it. First, a change in the vibration of the muddy ground beneath her body, then the unmistakable presence of something large approaching. Finally, a gentle whinny close to her ear. Thunder. The horse had escaped from the stable upon hearing the thunder, and instead of seeking shelter, had run directly to where Margaret was. With incredible gentleness, the animal partially knelt beside her, offering its body as support. Instinctively, Margaret grabbed the horse's mane, using it as support to stand up. Once on her feet, she leaned against the animal's flank, which remained absolutely still, as if understanding the importance of its stability at that moment. "Good boy," she murmured, caressing the horse's wet neck. "Let's get back to the porch." With slow and careful steps, using Thunder as a guide and support, Margaret managed to return to the safety of the porch. That's how Jack found her when he came running back a few minutes later. Sitting on the bench, soaked with Thunder faithfully standing by her side like a silent guardian. "My God, Margaret, what happened?" he asked, concern evident in his voice as he quickly approached. "I fell from the porch after the lightning struck," she explained, trembling slightly despite the humid heat. "Thunder. He came to me. He helped me get up and come back here." Jack stood motionless for a few seconds, absorbing the information. Then he approached the horse and stroked its neck with reverence. "I've never seen anything like this," he murmured, his voice choked with emotion. "It's as if he understood," Margaret completed, "as if he knew exactly what to do." The incident spread through town with impressive speed. Sophie, who had gone to deliver some orders at the ranch that same afternoon and witnessed Jack telling the incident to the veterinarian, couldn't help but share the story with some customers at the store. From them, the news propagated to the rest of Pine Creek. "It's practically a miracle," declared Father Joseph during Sunday Mass. "A reminder that God sometimes manifests through the most unlikely creatures." Hope Ranch began to receive curious visitors, local residents, families with children, even some tourists from neighboring towns who had heard about the heroic horse. Everyone wanted to see Thunder, take photos, witness with their own eyes the animal that demonstrated such extraordinary behavior. For Jack, this sudden attention was both welcome and uncomfortable. On one hand, the visits were beginning to generate a small additional income, as many visitors bought the ranch's products, cheeses, homemade sweets, crafts made by the employees. On the other hand, the privacy he so valued was compromised. "Maybe we should charge admission," suggested Margaret in a joking tone but with a hint of seriousness. $5 for adults, $3 for children. With the money you could start paying off the bank debt." They were sitting on the porch as usual, watching a group of visitors taking photos with Thunder at a respectful distance. The horse, normally wary of strangers, seemed to accept the attention with almost comical dignity. Jack laughed, running his hand through his graying hair. "It's not such an absurd idea. Yesterday, a reporter from the regional TV called wanting to do a story about Thunder. Apparently, stories about heroic animals have good ratings. And what did you answer? That I needed to consult Thunder himself since he's the star of the show," Jack joked. Then, more seriously, he added, "Actually, I said I don't know if I want all this exposure." Margaret nodded, understanding perfectly. After a lifetime of building walls around herself, she understood how disturbing it could be to have one's privacy invaded. "You know what they're saying in town, don't you?" she asked, slightly changing the subject. "About us?" "Yes. Apparently, we're living a late romance, worthy of a primetime soap opera." Jack smiled, though Margaret couldn't see it. "And that bothers you?" She considered the question for a few seconds before answering. "Strangely, no. Perhaps because, in a way, There's some truth to it. The statement hung between them, laden with possibilities. It wasn't an explicit declaration, but for two people who had spent almost 4 decades avoiding the subject, it represented a huge step. "Margaret," Jack began hesitantly, "have you ever wondered how it would have been? If we had stayed together, if things had been different?" She smiled, a smile that was both melancholic and serene. "Every day during the first few years. Then, I learned not to torture my mind with lost possibilities. But now, I'm beginning to think that perhaps some stories need a very long time to be written correctly." At that moment, Thunder approached, as if sensing that he was being indirectly mentioned in the conversation. The horse stopped near Margaret, his presence now familiar and comforting to her. "You know what's most curious, Jack? During all these years, I built an image of you in my mind, an image of someone cold, calculating, incapable of deep feelings. And it took just one accident, one fall on that bridge, for everything to change." "It wasn't just the accident," he replied. "It was Thunder. It was as if he forced us to see what we had been denying for decades." Margaret extended her hand, finding Jack's arm and squeezing it lightly. "Maybe some angels have 4 legs and a mane, not wings." The laughter they shared at that moment sealed something between them. Not a formal commitment or a promise, but the recognition of a possibility they thought was lost forever. Meanwhile, the news about Thunder's extraordinary behavior continued to spread. A professor of animal psychology from Midwest State University got in touch, interested in studying the case. Journalists from state media began to call. The small town of Pine Creek was slowly gaining attention on the map. Richard Montgomery, the bank manager who had negotiated the deal with Jack, returned to the ranch a few weeks later, this time with a different proposal. "Mr. Mercer, the board has reconsidered the situation," he announced, seated in the ranch office. "With all this positive publicity, Hope Ranch now represents a marketing opportunity for the bank." Jack raised his eyebrows, suspicious. "What exactly does that mean?" "It means we can renegotiate the terms of the agreement. We're willing to extend the payment deadline and reduce the area that would be ceded to the bank. In exchange, we would like to be able to use Thunder's story in our institutional publicity campaign." The proposal was tempting. With more favorable payment conditions and keeping more land, Jack could really save the ranch. However, there was a price to be paid: the commercialization of Thunder's story, something that deeply bothered him. "I need to think," he replied, "and consult with some people before deciding." The first person Jack sought naturally was Margaret. She listened attentively as he explained the terms of the proposal, seated in her usual place on the porch, with Thunder grazing peacefully a few meters away. "What would you do if you were in my place?" Jack asked after concluding the explanation. Margaret reflected for a few moments. "When I lost my sight, I received several offers to tell my inspiring story, how the blind girl overcame adversity. I refused them all. My pain, my struggle, my overcoming, none of it was for sale." Jack nodded, even knowing she couldn't see the gesture. "That's exactly how I feel. Using Thunder, commercializing something so pure, it seems wrong." The other hand, Margaret pondered, "it's not just about you. It's about the ranch, your family's legacy, the workers who depend on this place to survive." The dilemma was real and deep. Jack spent the night awake, considering all the implications of the decision he needed to make. By morning, still without a clear answer, he decided to do something he hadn't done in a long time. He mounted Thunder and went for a long ride around the property. He rode for hours, traversing every corner of the ranch, recalling stories from his childhood, of his parents, his grandparents. He remembered his father telling how his great-grandfather had built the main house with his own hands, how his mother always kept the garden blooming despite the challenging climate. When he finally returned to the main house, late in the afternoon, his decision was made. On the porch, to his surprise, he found Margaret talking animatedly with Sophie and Dr. Matthew. Everyone seemed excited about something. "Jack, it's good you're back," exclaimed the doctor upon seeing him. "We need to tell you what we've discovered." "Discovered?" Sophie came forward excitedly. "Yes, boss, I was organizing the old documents in the basement of the store, as Miss Margaret asked, and I found something incredible." Intrigued, Jack dismounted from Thunder and approached. The horse, as if sensing the importance of the moment, remained close, attentive to the conversation. "We found Thunder's genealogical record," explained Margaret, holding a yellowed folder, "and we discovered something that changes everything." "Thunder's genealogical record?" Jack furrowed his brow, confused. "What do you mean? I bought him from a breeder in Springfield 15 years ago. They never gave me complete documentation." "Exactly," confirmed Dr. Matthew, adjusting his glasses while Sophie carefully opened the yellowed folder on the porch table. "And that's what makes everything so extraordinary." Margaret, even though she couldn't see the documents, seemed the most excited of all. Her restless hands drummed on the table while Sophie organized the papers. "I'll explain from the beginning," Margaret started. "As you know, my father was an obsessive collector of records and documents. He kept everything: receipts, contracts, correspondence. After his death, I kept these archives in the basement of the store, more out of sentimentality than practical utility." Sophie was organizing these documents, she continued, when she found a folder titled Hope Ranch, 1985. Inside it were records of a transaction between my father and yours. Jack's eyes widened. "But that doesn't make sense. Our families didn't maintain business relations. Your father openly despised me." "Apparently not everything was as it seemed," intervened Dr. Matthew. "The document shows that Alexander Allen bought a purebred mare from Hope Ranch that year, a few months after Margaret returned to Pine Creek." "Do you remember Star?" asked Sophie excitedly. "Your father's favorite mare, boss. The one from the stories you always tell." Jack's expression changed from confusion to astonishment. "Star was sold after the Great Drought of '85. My father said a buyer from Indianapolis took her." "My father bought her," Margaret completed softly, "and according to these records, he kept her at a stud farm on the outskirts of Springfield, where she was bred with a prize-winning stallion. And the foal from that breeding." Sophie could barely contain her excitement. "Was Thunder's father," finished Dr. Matthew, pointing to a specific document. "The DNA doesn't lie. Thunder is a direct descendant of Star, the mare your father sold almost 40 years ago." Jack fell heavily into the wicker chair, stunned by the revelation. His gaze alternated between the documents spread out on the table and the impressive animal that grazed peacefully a few meters away, apparently oblivious to the fact that he was at the center of an extraordinary discovery. "But that means," he began, his voice choked with emotion, "that when you bought Thunder in Springfield," explained Margaret, "you were, without knowing it, bringing back to Hope Ranch a part of your own history, a connection with your father, with the past." "How did your father manage to hide this for so long?" asked Jack, still trying to process the information. Margaret sighed deeply before answering. "My father was a complicated man, Jack. Proud, stubborn, sometimes cruel in his determination. But he was also a man of deep regrets." She paused, as if carefully choosing her next words. "Among the documents, we also found a letter he never sent, addressed to you." Sophie, sensing the delicacy of the moment, removed a yellowed envelope from inside the folder and handed it to Jack. The paper was slightly wrinkled at the edges, as if it had been folded and unfolded many times by indecisive hands. "Would you like me to read it to you?" offered Dr. Matthew, but Jack declined with a gesture. With trembling fingers, he opened the envelope and began to read silently. As his eyes scanned the lines, his expression transformed. Surprise, confusion, and finally a painful understanding. When he finished, he carefully folded the letter and placed it in his shirt pocket, close to his heart. "What did it say?" Margaret asked softly. Jack took a deep breath before answering. He asked for forgiveness, explained that separating us was the biggest mistake of his life, but that pride prevented him from admitting it until it was too late. The purchase of Star. It was an attempt to establish some kind of connection, even if secret, with my family. And he never had the courage to deliver the letter, completed Margaret, a slight tremor in her voice betraying the contained emotion. nor to reveal the truth about the mayor, added Jack. And now, 4 decades later, Thunder brings us together again. Thunder, as if sensing that he was the center of the conversation, slowly approached the porch. The animal seemed to carry an almost supernatural dignity, as if somehow understanding his role in that complex web of intertwined destinies. "This changes everything regarding the bank's proposal," said Jack after a few moments of reflection. "Now it's not just about a horse with unusual behavior, it's a story of redemption, of circles that close after decades." "And what do you plan to do?" asked Dr. Matthew. "Refuse the original proposal," Jack answered with determination, "but offer something different. A partnership where the complete story is told, not just about a heroic horse, but about how the past sometimes finds surprising ways to correct its own mistakes." Margaret smiled, a genuine smile that illuminated her normally austere face. "I think my father would approve of this decision." In the days that followed, the revelation about Thunder's origin added a new layer to the story that already fascinated the residents of Pine Creek. What was previously seen as mere curiosity, a horse with extraordinary behavior, transformed into an almost mythical narrative about intertwined destinies, family secrets, and the surprising circularity of life. Richard Montgomery, the bank manager, was initially disappointed with the refusal of the original proposal, but intrigued by Jack's counter-proposal, a campaign based not on the commercial exploitation of an unusual animal, but on the complete story, including the recent discovery about Thunder's origin, had potential for an even greater impact. "I'll need to consult with the board," he said, "but personally I believe this story is even more valuable than what we initially had." Spring came to Pine Creek, bringing with it an explosion of colors in the countryside and significant changes for Hope Ranch. The agreement with the bank was finally closed on favorable terms. Jack would keep 80% of his land. The payment deadline would be extended, and the story of Thunder and his historical connections would be used in a sophisticated and respectful institutional campaign. The first part of the campaign was a 15-minute documentary, initially shown on regional channels and then widely shared on social media. Titled Invisible Bonds, the video told not only Thunder's recent story, but also the saga of 2 families whose destinies crossed, separated, and finally reconnected through generations. Margaret, initially reluctant to appear in the documentary, ended up playing a central role. Her narrative about the discovery of the documents, combined with the story of the interrupted relationship with Jack, brought a human dimension that deeply touched viewers. "I never thought that at 60 I would be telling this story," she confessed during filming. "Some wounds seem impossible to heal, but then something happens, something apparently small like a horse saving its owner, and suddenly the impossible becomes possible." The documentary achieved surprising success. In a few weeks, Hope Ranch began to receive visitors from all over the country: tourists, journalists, animal behavior scholars, and even ordinary people who simply felt touched by the story and wanted to personally meet Thunder. Margaret's craft store also experienced a sudden boom. With the media exposure, her products, especially the embroideries she personally created despite her blindness, became highly sought after. Sophie, her young assistant, needed to hire 2 helpers to handle the growing demand. "I never liked crowds," commented Margaret one afternoon, as she and Jack watched a group of tourists taking photos with Thunder at a respectful distance. "But I must admit there's something gratifying about seeing how our story resonates with so many people. It's as if everyone was waiting for proof that it's not too late," replied Jack, serving more coffee. "That mistakes can be corrected, that bonds can be restored no matter how much time has passed." Life at Hope Ranch had acquired a new routine. 3 days a week were reserved for visitors, with tours guided by Jack himself, always culminating in a meeting with Thunder. The other days were dedicated to the normal work of the ranch and increasingly frequently to private moments between Jack and Margaret. The relationship between them had evolved naturally, without rush or pressure. They weren't just 2 seniors reviving a youthful romance. They were souls who, after decades of separate experiences, were discovering each other again, wiser, more patient, more willing to value each shared moment. One afternoon, as they slowly walked through the ranch's orchard, Jack guiding Margaret by the arm, a question arose almost spontaneously. "Have you ever thought about coming to live here?" he asked, his calm voice masking the importance of the question. Margaret stopped walking, turning her face in the direction of his voice. "Are you inviting me to live with you, Jack Mercer?" "I am," he replied simply. "This house is too big for just one person. And to be honest, I don't like being alone anymore." A soft smile appeared on Margaret's lips. "And what would the town say? Two old people living in sin?" Jack laughed. "At this point in life, I think we deserve the right not to care what others think." She considered the proposal for a few moments before answering. "My independence has always been very important to me, Jack. I built my life around it after losing my sight." "I know," he replied, "and I'm not asking you to abandon it. I'm suggesting that we share our lives, each maintaining their essence. Besides," he added with a smile in his voice, "I'm sure Thunder would be happy to have you around every day." Margaret smiled, extending her hand to touch Jack's face, a rare gesture that demonstrated the depth of her feelings. "I'll seriously consider the invitation." What neither of them noticed, absorbed in the conversation, was the silent presence observing them a few meters away. Thunder, motionless under the shade of an apple tree, seemed to supervise that crucial moment with the same vigilant attention he had demonstrated since the accident on the bridge. The next morning, something unexpected happened. The ranch employees noticed that Thunder had disappeared from his stable. The search began immediately, with Jack leading a team around the property. After almost 2 hours of searching, when concern was already beginning to transform into panic, one of the workers came running back with news. "Boss, we found Thunder. You won't believe where he is." "Where is he?" asked Jack, his heart racing with worry. Thunder had never run away before. His sudden disappearance was completely out of character. "At Miss Margaret's store," replied the employee, still breathless from running. "He's standing in front of the door as if waiting for someone. Half the town is already there, taking pictures." Jack was momentarily speechless, trying to process the information. The craft store was almost 4 miles from the ranch. To get there, Thunder would have to cross the bridge, travel the main road, and navigate the town streets, a route that would require not only physical strength but an almost human understanding of direction and purpose. "My God," he finally murmured. "I need to go there immediately." In 15 minutes, Jack was driving his old Jeep down the dirt road connecting the ranch to town, the red dust rising behind the vehicle like a cloud. His mind was a whirlwind of theories and concerns. How had Thunder found his way to the store? What could have motivated the animal to make such a journey? Upon reaching the central square of Pine Creek, Jack immediately noticed the commotion. A small crowd had gathered in front of Margaret's craft store, cell phones raised to record the moment. At the center of attention, majestic and apparently calm, stood Thunder. The horse remained motionless in front of the closed door of the store, as if patiently waiting for someone to open it. He showed no signs of stress or agitation, despite the crowd around him. He behaved as if he were exactly where he should be. Jack parked the Jeep and approached on foot, making his way through the curious onlookers. Sophie was at the door of the store, visibly agitated, trying simultaneously to keep spectators at a safe distance and to understand the extraordinary situation. "Mr. Jack, thank God!" exclaimed the young woman upon seeing him. "He arrived almost an hour ago alone. He simply appeared and stood here without moving." "Where is Margaret?" asked Jack, cautiously approaching Thunder, who whinnied softly upon recognizing his owner. "She hasn't arrived yet," replied Sophie. "Today is Thursday. She always comes later because she goes to the health clinic first for her weekly checkup." At that moment, as if summoned by the conversation, a taxi stopped on the other side of the square. Margaret got out of the vehicle with the driver's help, her white cane probing the familiar path. She wore a simple but elegant navy blue outfit, and her gray hair was arranged in a careful bun. Even before anyone could warn her about the unusual situation, Thunder whinnied again, louder this time, a sound that almost seemed like a call. Margaret stopped immediately, her head turning in the direction of the sound. "Thunder?" she murmured, incredulous. "What?" The horse, upon seeing Margaret, did something even more surprising. Slowly, with a grace that seemed impossible for an animal of that size, he partially knelt, exactly as he had done during the storm, when he helped Margaret get up after the fall. A collective murmur ran through the crowd. Several people began to film the scene with their cell phones. The animal's behavior was so unusual, so charged with apparent intentionality, that even the most skeptical felt touched. Jack approached Margaret, gently touching her arm. "He came to you," he said simply. "Alone. He found his way from the ranch to here." Margaret brought her hand to her mouth, her blind eyes moist with contained tears. "How is this possible?" "I don't know," Jack answered honestly. "But I think he's trying to tell us something." With Jack's help, Margaret slowly approached Thunder. The horse remained still, only his muzzle moving gently in her direction when she got close enough to touch him. "Hello, my friend," she murmured, stroking the animal's mane. "What are you doing so far from home?" It was at that moment that Margaret noticed something unusual attached to Thunder's mane. Her sensitive fingers detected a small object intertwined with the animal's coarse hair. "Jack, there's something here," she said, her fingers carefully working to release the object. It was a small velvet box, the kind used to keep jewelry. Jack recognized it immediately. It had belonged to his mother, kept for decades in a drawer in the ranch house. How Thunder managed not only to find it, but also to bring it here, was a mystery that defied any rational explanation. "What is this?" asked Margaret, holding the box carefully. Jack was silent for a moment, his gaze alternating between the velvet box, Margaret's expectant face, and the horse that seemed to be watching the scene with an almost human attention. "It's a box that belonged to my mother," he finally answered, his voice choked with emotion. "I've kept it all these years." With hesitant fingers, Margaret opened the small box. Inside was a ring, simple but elegant, with a stone she couldn't see, but which her sensitive fingers identified as smooth and polished. "It's an aquamarine," explained Jack, watching as she delicately explored the jewel. "It was my mother's engagement ring. My father gave it to her when they were only 20 years old." The crowd around, perceiving the intensity of the moment, had fallen silent. Even the most talkative now observed, with an almost reverential respect. "Jack," murmured Margaret, her voice trembling slightly, "what's happening here?" He took a deep breath, looking at Thunder, who remained motionless, almost solemn in his posture. It was as if the animal had consciously created this moment, this opportunity. "I think Thunder decided to answer the question I asked yesterday," said Jack, a slight smile in his voice, "about you coming to live at the ranch." Margaret smiled, tears now flowing freely down her face, and apparently he doesn't accept "I'll think about it" as an answer. Jack gently took the box from her hands and, to everyone's surprise, including his own, knelt down. At 58, with knees painful from decades of working the land, the gesture wasn't easy, but it carried a powerful symbolism. "Margaret Allen," he began, holding her hand, "we lost almost 4 decades because of pride, lies, and misunderstandings. I don't want to lose even one more day. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" A collective sigh ran through the crowd. Sophie, who was watching everything from nearby, covered her mouth with her hands, tears glistening in her young eyes. Dr. Matthew, who had arrived attracted by the commotion, smiled openly, as if he had always known this moment would come. Margaret remained motionless for a few seconds, her expression a complex mixture of emotions: surprise, joy, a hint of fear, and finally, determination. "Yes," she answered simply. "Yes, Jack Mercer, we've waited too long for this." When Jack placed the ring on her finger, spontaneous applause erupted from the crowd. Thunder, as if satisfied with the result of his intervention, whinnied softly and finally stood up, stopping beside the couple like a silent guardian. The news of Jack and Margaret's engagement, and Thunder's extraordinary role in making it happen, spread quickly beyond the borders of Pine Creek. Journalists from national media began to arrive, fascinated not only by the unusual behavior of the horse, but by the love story that had withstood 4 decades of separation. The Cupid horse of the Midwest was how a major weekly magazine described Thunder in its cover story. The program 2020 sent a team to record a special. Animal behavior scientists from renowned universities expressed interest in studying the case. Amid all this attention, Jack and Margaret remained surprisingly serene. The shared experience of having lived so long with their private pain had given them a unique ability to filter what really mattered from what was just passing noise. The wedding was held 2 months later, in a simple ceremony at Hope Ranch itself. Celebrated by Father Joseph under an old apple tree in the yard of the main house, the event brought together practically the entire population of Pine Creek, as well as journalists, researchers, and the curious who had traveled from afar to witness the outcome of that extraordinary story. Thunder, of course, had a prominent role. Impeccably brushed and adorned with a garland of native Midwestern wildflowers, the horse remained close to the couple throughout the ceremony, behaving with an almost supernatural dignity. "I've never seen anything like it in my entire career," commented Dr. Lucinda Martin, an equine behavior specialist from the University of Michigan, who had traveled especially to observe Thunder. "There's an emotional connection there that defies traditional scientific categories." Life at Hope Ranch found a new balance after the wedding. Margaret decided to keep the craft store, now mainly managed by Sophie, but moved permanently to the ranch. Jack's once isolated dwelling transformed into a vibrant home, filled with the energy and strong opinions of his new wife. The agreement with the bank evolved into an even broader partnership. Inspired by the story of Jack, Margaret, and Thunder, Richard Montgomery proposed the creation of a foundation aimed at preserving historic farms in the region and promoting sustainable rural tourism. Hope Ranch became the pilot project, receiving resources for restoration and development of educational activities. "Who would have thought?" commented Margaret one afternoon, as she and Jack watched a group of students participating in a craft workshop in the ranch's old barn, now converted into a cultural space, "that at the end of our lives, we would be starting something completely new." "They say it's never too late to start over," replied Jack, holding her hand, "but I admit we needed a rather peculiar push." At that moment, as if knowing he was being mentioned, Thunder appeared trotting softly across the open field near the house. The setting sun enhanced his powerful silhouette, creating almost an aura around him. "You know what intrigues me the most?" asked Margaret, turning her face in the direction of the sound of hooves. "We'll never really know how he did it, how he found the way to the store, how he knew about the ring. Some mysteries. Perhaps are better when not completely unraveled," replied Jack. "As my grandmother used to say, there are more things between heaven and earth than our philosophy dreams of." The following years brought significant changes to Pine Creek. The small town, previously forgotten on the map, became a modest but constant tourist destination. The story of Jack, Margaret, and Thunder attracted visitors from all over the country, stimulating the local economy and creating new opportunities for young people who, previously, needed to migrate to big cities in search of work. Thunder, although continuing to exhibit unusual behaviors, especially his evident preference for Margaret's company, never again performed feats as extraordinary as those that marked the couple's reunion. It was as if, once his mission was accomplished, he had returned to an existence closer to normal, though always maintaining that special aura that distinguished him. On a spring morning, 5 years after the wedding, Jack and Margaret received an unexpected visit. An elderly gentleman, appearing to be over 80, arrived at the ranch accompanied by a young man who seemed to be his grandson. "My name is Edward Allen," the visitor introduced himself. "I'm Margaret's distant cousin, son of Uncle August, who lived in Indianapolis." After the warm reception and inevitable exchange of family stories, Edward revealed the true reason for his visit. "I found this among my father's belongings," he said, extending a yellowed envelope. "It's a letter from Uncle Alexander, Margaret's father, dated a few months before his death. I believe you should read it." With Jack's help, Margaret heard the contents of the letter, a detailed account of how Alexander had meticulously planned the purchase of the mare Star, her controlled breeding through generations, and how he had left specific instructions for the direct descendant to be sold to Jack when he reached the appropriate age. "He writes here," read Jack with a choked voice, "that this would be his way of trying to correct the harm he caused, that he didn't have the courage to face you directly, but that he hoped that someday, through this special animal, you might find a way back to each other." Margaret covered her face with her hands, tears flowing between her fingers. "So it wasn't a coincidence," she murmured. "My father orchestrated everything decades ago." "Not everything," Edward gently corrected. "According to the letter, he only arranged for Thunder to return to Hope Ranch. The rest, the accident on the bridge, the extraordinary behavior of the animal, that was beyond any human planning." That night, after the visitors had departed, Jack and Margaret sat on the porch as they did every day, sharing the comfortable silence of those who no longer need words to communicate. Thunder grazed peacefully a few meters away, occasionally raising his head as if checking that both were well. "So in the end, we were part of a larger plan," reflected Margaret, "devised by my father, but executed by forces that go beyond our understanding. Life rarely follows a single script," replied Jack, serving a bit more coffee for both. "I think we are all part of a story that began long before us and will continue long after we're gone." And so, under the starry sky of the American Midwest, they found peace in that shared certainty. Their lives, marked by separation and reunion, by pain and redemption, were part of a larger fabric, a broader pattern where even mistakes and detours eventually found their purpose. Thunder, the silent witness to this journey, would continue to be for the residents of Pine Creek a living symbol that time that mysterious weaver has surprising ways of repairing its own tears, and that sometimes the deepest bonds, those that truly matter, need only the right opportunity to reveal their unshakable strength. Dear listeners, we hope that Jack and Margaret's story has touched your hearts. To follow more exciting journeys like this one, we've prepared a special playlist with equally captivating narratives. Find it here by clicking on the link to your left. If this story about second chances and redemption has awakened something in you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave your like on the video. Every day, we bring unique stories that explore the complexity of life and the surprises that destiny holds for us. Share in the comments if you've ever witnessed an inexplicable connection like Thunder's with Jack and Margaret. The most interesting stories may be adapted in our upcoming productions. Until next time,